Hi, everyone. My name is David J. Kent, and in celebration of the release of my new book called Lincoln in New England In Search of His Forgotten Tours, I'm going to give a little bit of background on each of the 6 states in New England. So, this isn't the presentation I'm giving about the book. This is just to give a little bit of background on each Lincoln's connections with each of the 6 New England states. So, I'll do one state per video. And tonight we're going to talk about Maine. Now, Lincoln went to New England twice in his career. Once was in 1848 when he was a sitting congressman. He went up and he spoke in Massachusetts about a dozen times to campaign for Zachary Taylor, the Whig nominee for president. Uh, then he didn't come back again for 12 years. In 1860, after he had given the Cooper Union speech, he went up to New England again, ostensibly to visit his son in New Hampshire, but ended up giving another 12 a dozen speeches. So on neither one of those trips did he make it to Maine. Now he actually was invited to go to Maine while he was up in New Hampshire. So southern New Hampshire, it's very, very close to the border of Maine. But on a day he was in Dover, New Hampshire, he received a hand-delivered message that said, on behalf of the Republican City Committee of the City of Portland, and we hereby extend an invitation to you to visit our city at any time that may suit your convenience within a few weeks, and address our citizens on political questions. The bearer of this, Mr. Samuel R. Levitt, is authorized to make such arrangements with you that may be necessary for the furtherance of this object. And it's signed Lewis B. Smith, Chairman, and Henry P. Lord, Secretary of this Republican City Committee of Portland. Now, we know he didn't go to Maine, so he did not go on this trip for this invitation. We don't technically even know that he received this. It was hand delivered. It was hand delivered. The document is not in Basler's collected works, but it is in the papers of Abraham Lincoln, the Library of Congress. There is no response that we're aware of. So we don't know whether he just simply told this Samuel P. Levitt that I can't make it because I'm too busy, or whether he had signed something and whatever he wrote was lost. But clearly he didn't make it. He was turning down a lot of requests to give speeches. And to go to Portland would have been at least 2 days out of the way. And he was already committed to giving other speeches in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And he had to get back home to Illinois because he had a day job. He had to make some money because he had been in Congress for several months. So he was anxious to get home and he couldn't do it. Now, that said, there are plenty of connections Lincoln has with Maine. So the most obvious is Hannibal Hamlin, who was his first vice president. Hamlin was born in Maine, and I should say he was born in what became Maine, because a lot of these people were born prior to 1820, which was when Maine became a state. Prior to that, Maine was the upper counties of Massachusetts. And I'll come back to when Maine became a state in a minute. So Hannibal Hamlin, interestingly enough, was very, very good friends with William H. Seward. They were both senators at the time. But even he had his misgivings about Seward. He had written his wife and said, Seward is going to win, and he's a good man, but I can't help feeling like we could do somehow better, because he knew some of the issues that Seward had. So that was Hannibal Hamlin. Now, there's a few other people that come into Lincoln's life that are very important. One is Elijah Lovejoy. Now, you probably heard that name, and Elijah Lovejoy was born in Maine. Again, a small town, Albion, Maine, when it was still the upper counties of Massachusetts. Lovejoy moves from Maine, he eventually makes it out to Missouri, and then he's basically chased out of Missouri into Alton, Illinois, where he is murdered. Because remember, Elijah Lovejoy is become an abolitionist publisher, a newspaper publisher, and they throw his press in the river for like the fourth time, and they murder him. Lincoln mentions Lovejoy or alludes to Lovejoy. He doesn't mention his name specifically, but he alludes to Lovejoy in his Lyceum address. So there was a connection there. Now, another Mainer that we don't think of as being from Maine is Leonard Swett. Swett was born in Maine. He went to school in Maine. He read law in Maine, but eventually he made his way out to Illinois, and he became one of the traveling lawyers in the 8th Judicial Circuit along with Lincoln, and they would spend 3 months in the spring and 3 months in the fall in riding around the central part of Illinois in the 8th Judicial Circuit. Well, Swett, when it came time for the Republican convention in Chicago, David Davis, who was the judge on that circuit, he was in charge of Lincoln's campaign, and he was very cleverly used people that were from eastern states and had them talk to the eastern delegates. So he had Leonard Swett speak to the Maine delegates, and it became very important, and I'll talk about that in a second. Just a couple other names from Maine that are important. James Blaine, who was a senator during the Civil War. He had been involved in, he was a former governor of Maine. He was a little bit of everything, but he was a senator during the Civil War. He actually later on becomes the Republican presidential nominee in 1884. But he lost to Grover Cleveland. But he has a lot of interaction with Lincoln during the war. Another former governor who was in the Senate was Lot Morrill. Lot Morrill is related to the Morrill who was the Morrill Land Grant College that worked very closely with Lincoln on land grant issues and some other issues. Lot Morrill becomes Grant's Secretary-Treasurer later on. And since I'm talking about Treasury Secretaries, another Mainer is William Pitt Fessenden. He was kind of a thorn in Lincoln's side for a while he was in Congress. He was in the Senate. He was part of the committee that was, give Lincoln a hard time about the war. He became Lincoln's Treasury Secretary for a very short period of time, several months, after Samuel P. Chase was chased out of the secretary job. Fessenden Lincoln basically says, you're going to be my Treasury Secretary since you're so interested in it. So he was the Treasury Secretary. Interestingly enough about Fessenden, later on when they had the trial in the Senate, the impeachment trial for Andrew Johnson, Fessenden was the very first Republican who voted not guilty. And there were 6 other Republicans who voted not guilty, and Andrew Johnson managed to avoid being convicted in his impeachment trial by 1 vote. So Fessenden played an important role in that. Now, one other person I'll mention related to Maine that is in fact related to Lincoln is Enoch Lincoln. Enoch Lincoln is his real name, and he is really a distant relative to Lincoln. They both come from the same line of Samuel Lincoln in Hingham, Mass. So Lincoln did not meet Enoch Lincoln. However, when Lincoln had gone up to Massachusetts in 1848, he had dinner with Levi Lincoln Jr. Now, Levi Lincoln is Enoch's brother. And Levi had been a prominent governor in Massachusetts. And that's when Lincoln realized that, hey, I have relatives up here. And he was started to look into his relationship with the Lincolns from Hingham. So that was pretty important. Now, it's interesting. I wanted to keep this short, but I wanted to mention one more thing that I mentioned in the radio program called Maine Calling on the Maine public radio station a couple weeks ago. I said, I think that I'm going to say something that nobody has ever said before, and that's Maine helped make Lincoln president. And there are two reasons why I said that. So Maine, remember, became a state in 1820 as part of the Missouri Compromise. Maine had been the upper counties of Massachusetts. They had petitioned to become a state. And of course, they would be a free state. Well, the South didn't want that because there at that time were equal number of free states and slave states. They said, you can't come in as a free state because that'll throw off the balance. So they argued a bit for a while, and they ended up with a Missouri Compromise, which said, okay, Maine can come in as a state and a free state, but Missouri comes in as a slave state. Now, the important part of this is that the Missouri Compromise also included a, a ban on slavery in the northern territories north of the southern border of Missouri, except for obviously Missouri. All of that territory was from the Louisiana Purchase, and it was still territory. So all of that was banned. So Maine came in as part of that Missouri Compromise. Now, flash forward to 1854. Now you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repeals the Missouri Compromise. So in kind of this roundabout way, Maine was the reason why this repeal of the Missouri Compromise was the reason why Lincoln was aroused back into politics. He had been working as a lawyer for the last 5 years, hadn't been in political office, and decided, I need to get back into office so that I can fight this thing. And we know that he ran for Senate a couple of times in the 1850s and lost, and then eventually he was president. So there's a second reason why Maine played a contribution, at least, in making Lincoln president. And this is a little bit more direct. When they went to the Chicago Convention in 1860, the voting for your favorite candidate to be the nominee went from east to west. And Maine is as far east as you can get in the United States then and now. So Maine voted first. Now they had 16 votes, and they gave 10 of those votes to William H. Seward, which everybody expected because New England is right next to New York. Seward was a Whig, the Republican leader. He had been governor. He was a senator right now in New York. And Seward expected all of New England to go his way. So Maine gave 10 of their 16 to Seward. But they gave the other 6 to Lincoln, which was a surprise to everyone that they would give 6 to Lincoln. They didn't have a native son in the race, so they didn't have like a local guy that they could give their votes to. So they gave all the other 6 votes to Lincoln. You saw a similar thing actually in New Hampshire, and then you saw some additional dynamics. But because Lincoln had worked so hard to get Illinois all in his camp and Indiana in his camp, and because of people like Leonard Swett, and because of Lincoln's tour of New England 2-3 months before he went the Republican National Convention, people remembered him. And they said, hey, this guy is a good alternative. Because Maine did that and some other states, it basically gave some tacit permission to the other states to pick Lincoln. And of course, when the first ballot was finished counting, Seward had 172 votes, like everybody expected. Lincoln had 102. And the next closest, the third place, was less than 50. Clearly, Lincoln was the second most viable person to Seward. And then we saw shifts in the second round and then in the third round. So Maine played a part in getting Lincoln nominated, of course, getting him made him president, because New England pretty much voted for the Republican candidate, which was Lincoln. So that's Abraham Lincoln and Maine in brief. I wanted to keep these short. I have a lot more details in the book, in Lincoln and New England book. So in the next video, I'm going to take on Vermont, which is the other state in New England that he did not go to, but becomes very important in his lifetime. So tune in for the next video, which will be the next night. Thank you.